right, now that I've been an exceedingly rude host, get that out of the way. Taylor, I forget, are you an upcoming speaker or were you a previous speaker? You look familiar. Your name looks familiar. Or you're a speaker today, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm the speaker today.
That's what it is. I knew it was something. You see how totally distracted I am. Like, that name's familiar. Yes, our speaker is here. Great. Well, because I've been setting up the next 3 or 4 weeks, it all kind of blurs together. And then it's like I have to go into the meeting. It's like, yeah, what's today's meeting on?
Yeah, I know that feeling.
I need
so I'll preface this for everybody else in the room. Taylor and I know each other fairly well. So Taylor, how many times have you walked into a room and have somebody say, "Why the hell are you here again?"
Enough.
Awesome. Yeah. Morning, Alan. How are you?
Doing well. Yourself?
Good. You got a lag there. Okay. You're not talking, but you're talking. That's interesting. So
Brian's here now. He can make you look good, right?
But that's generally what he does. That's why he's here. There's Brian. Good afternoon, Brian.
Good morning, Chris.
How are you? Are you stable now? Are you working?
I'm stable. I'm not too sure about the computer.
Okay. Well, sometimes the computers are stable than you are. Because it's really cool. I mean, it's great having this resource. I've got and now we have 204 papers we've presented. Most of those are from the Research Lodge. Some are from a lot of them are from A. Douglas Smith. Some are my own that I've given at other places. But we've got a good database going of papers. And some of them, they were put out as a spreading the light, back in 2020. So even those of you who've been reading papers all along, you probably wouldn't mind hearing it read. It's not like it was one from last week or anything. I don't want to do that. Here's last week's paper, and now we're going to read it.
Last month, I read the one on masonry and railroading.
Yes.
At Lodge, and they like that one.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yes. And we appreciate that. As long as you say so-and-so wrote it and they delivered it here originally, we're perfectly fine with sharing it with the rest of the world.
Yep. Always attribute my source.
Yep. You just can't put it in on your website. That's all we have. Anyway, it's after 10 o'clock, so welcome everyone. This is Virginia Research Lodge's unstated meeting, and I'm going to go ahead and put some links in the chat here. We have 7 people. We're going to go with that. I never know how many are going to show, so we have here in our links, and most of y'all already have these, but we have our link to our Facebook group where we post all of our papers and announce these meetings. We have our Research Lodge website where we have all of our papers and other interesting things. All of the research bodies in Virginia get mentioned. And then we have a link to our YouTube channel. That's the one, the Unstateds, that has all of our unstated meetings. And if you're watching us on YouTube right now, please like and subscribe. And then there's my email. If you're on Facebook, message me to get added to our mailing list. If not, then you can email me to get added to our mailing list. So we're already after 10 o'clock, and I've talked about virtually nothing important so far. So it's a typical meeting here. I do have an exciting announcement about, I'll say at the end, about our next Unstated. It's going to be another panel, and I'm kind of excited about putting that together. So we have several things lined up. I'm really excited about those. But I'm most excited, and I did not forget that Brother Taylor Kleineick is our speaker today. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce him and let him tell us what lodge he belongs to. And go ahead and start. Do you have a presentation, or is this just spoken?
No, I have a slideshow.
Okay, let me go ahead and give you permissions then when you're ready. All right, and go ahead, Taylor.
All right, let me start the slideshow. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. To start off with, my name is Taylor Kleineick. I am a past master of High Point Lodge 773 in Monroe, Ohio. Member of a couple other lodges in Ohio, current worshipful master of the Ohio Lodge of Research, and one of the regents for the Royal Schofield Society. This presentation is part of a larger ongoing series of research I'm doing on the system of Freemasonry and how it operates as a system using systems thinking and complexity theory, psychology, and those sorts of things. It originally came about as part of a series of conversations I was having with worshipful brother Chad Simpson, who passed away last year. I had just been a Mason for about a year, and Chad was putting on the Freemasonry and Civil War Symposium for the third year in Cincinnati, Ohio. I had been a Mason, a Master Mason for I think about 6 months at the time. This was the first kind of big Masonic research event that I'd gone to, and kind of by all accounts, it failed. What happened was the major group of people who would be interested in this topic, the Civil War and Freemasonry, had another event that day, a competing event. They were at a Civil War reenactment. They were a new lodge in Ohio. They were one of our few special lodges out there called Pioneer Lodge. And they had just been constituted as a lodge. And they were going to meet in a reenactment event about 12 miles north of where we were meeting. So of the 30 to 40 people we would expect to be there, we had two. They had sent a detachment of two brothers to the event to say that they're happy this was going on, to send their regards. But in total, there were 6 people, excluding those two brothers, which actually had left. And it got worse from there. So they had invited out the Deputy Grand Master of Kansas, Brother Michael Halloran, who had just published his book, Better Angels of Our Nature. This is a book about the legends of Freemasonry during the Civil War. If you haven't read it, it's an excellent book, and I'd highly recommend it. And he's trying to set up for this low turnout event, which was in one of the Cincinnati Masonic Center's most beautiful rooms, but it sat about 150 people. As we were trying to get set up, as they're hoping more people would show up, and they're kind of delaying the start of the presentation. There were issues with the AV equipment, and they couldn't actually prepare the slideshow. The audio equipment wasn't working. It's kind of hard to hear them. And eventually what we decided to do was to move it outside of the lodge room and into a adjacent room and sit around a table and kind of pass around some of the stuff they'd brought with them and look on off of his laptop. And that really changed the tone of the event from something that was, really struggling, was going to be maybe pretty awkward. There were a lot of empty spaces, empty seats around the room. People were kind of sitting far apart from each other, despite plenty of, seats right by the presenter. There were a lot of people sitting kind of towards the back of the room. But by bringing that group together, instead of having it, just somebody lecturing at you, we had a conversation with Brother Halloran about his book, and he was able to show us some of the actual documentation that he had and some of the stuff that wasn't originally in this presentation. It was a much more interactive meeting. And that really started this idea that the effects of our room and the way that we're handling our meetings has an impact on what the meeting's like. And we'll talk about kind of seating a little bit later, but teachers will tell you that the way you arrange your classroom seating is a big part of what goes on in the class. So first, let's get into the title of this work. What does it mean to right-size a lodge? This isn't a euphemism for downsizing. It's more akin to how do we tailor our approach to Freemasonry based on, our current size. We're really trying to fit everything that we're doing and optimize it so that the current size of the lodge is reflected in our practices. And that we're not doing something that's really, wasteful of everybody's time. That makes sense to do in a really large lodge, or we're doing the same thing, but for a traditionalist, for a small lodge. And it's really not about saving lodges. It's more about kind of skillfully applying Freemasonry to what we're actually doing, right? You can't just take the same size stone and put it into any building. There is, a fitting that has to be done for each project that you're doing. And it's also part of the idea that Freemasonry is an institution, and institutions use rules and organizes the relationships to affect this outcome. So that the way we have organized our lodges, our meeting spaces, our interactions with the district and the state really have an impact on what we do. This is from the Edinburgh Register House manuscript from 1696. What makes a true and perfect lodge? 7 masters, 5 entered apprentices, a day's journey from a borough town without bark of dog or crock of co. 6 does no less make a true and perfect lodge. Yes, 5 masons and 3 entered apprentices, etc. Does no less. The more the merrier, and the fewer the better cheer. What this says to me is that Freemasonry should be adjusting itself based on how many people are there, and that there is not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. And going back to the tailoring analogy, I'm sure I'm not the only Mason who's ever had, their chutes shrink at the dry cleaner. That adjusting what we do in our practices and the practice of Freemasonry needs to be adjusted for our size. Whether that is adjusting practices as we get larger, or adjusting them as we get smaller, or adjusting them based on the rooms that we meet in, changing the locations, the geography of our communities even. So what do I mean by geometry? Geometry really is about relationships between things. By knowing the relationships or the postulates, we can figure out more information about geometric objects. When we understand how humans think and work, we're better equipped to understand what we are doing kind of in our lodge rooms. As we understand those relationships between lodge brothers, we can build a better understanding of the world and our personal role in it when we think about this in terms of relationships. So for example, this is a diagram constructed by Jeffrey Blaisdell from his blog, where he derives the square and compass from a circle. But that's really complicated, and I'm not really good at math, so I like to use this as an example. We have 2 lines here, A and B, intersected by line T. And from this, we know that every angle marked beta is the exact same angle. That by understanding a relationship between, line A and line T, we now have some understanding about line B and line T. And this is a theme that pops up throughout geometry, that we can make these connections and kind of find out these relationships using these postulates. So as a initiatic society, what we do is we bring people into our in-group, part of our brotherhood. We make them brothers. A lot of our older traditions are really tailored to doing this. They cement our new brother into our lodge and connect them with the older brethren within the lodge. And a good example of this is singing and group formation. If you look at a lot of the old Masonic documents, there are plenty of Masonic songs and song books out there. In Ohio, in our masturbation ritual, we use Peel's hymn with lyrics written by Brother Vernon. And this is really important because music, and you look at music theory, it's about relationships between notes and how they connect, and beautiful harmonies and melodies. But in the social setting, what we need to understand is that singing quickly creates bonds between people who are participants. This is why you see singing in churches, at sports events, and in lodges back in the day. This works kind of through the icebreaker effect, where you get past that kind of sense of not being part of the group by participating in the group activity, and then activity that you might not necessarily be great as. But like, I'm not a great singer, but I always sing, wholeheartedly in lodge events, because it helps bring that sense of camaraderie together. And so singing is one of those ways that we've demonstrated psychologically in a number of studies that you can actually make people feel like they're part of a group really, really quickly. It doesn't necessarily create the strongest bond, but it does create the bond very quickly. And we have lots of these traditions in Freemasonry that help create both bonds quickly and very deep bonds. We look at right-sizing our lodge practices. I think shaking hands is a really good example of two different places where we can see the differences in lodge size. At my mother lodge High Point, where we have usually about 10 to 16 people show up for a meeting, it's very easy to go around and shake everybody's hand before the meeting starts and say hi and catch up with them. If you look at another event at the Grand Lodge of Ohio Annual Communications, we have all of our district deputies and our district education officers be introduced by the Grand Lodge and shake the Grand Lodge officers' hands. We have 25 districts, with each district having, I believe, 2 to 4 district deputy Grand Masters and 1 to 3 DEOs. They are introducing a couple hundred people, and it takes, quite a while to do that. I think for most of our meetings at the Grand Lodge of Ohio are introductions, either by of their DEOs or installing them or introducing visiting dignitaries. And so you can see that, to easily go around at a small lodge like High Point, spend 15, 20 minutes shaking everybody's hand versus spending an hour to 2 hours at Grand Lodge just reading somebody's name and having them shake somebody's hand. That the practice of shaking hands doesn't exactly scale well depending on the setting that you're in. Back in the day, I used to use this as an argument to maybe rework how our Grand Lodge annual communications go, that we could save a lot of time by not introducing people or having a running slideshow. Instead of having everybody shake their hand. That isn't necessarily something that you'd have to do. The question is, what is the value that we're delivering here by introducing everybody? Which is that a lot of these men have spent, at least a decade serving their districts in some capacity, some many more than that. And, to have them, introduce and at Grand Lodge is a pretty big honor for them. Now, taking that away isn't really necessarily something that is good. But when you're looking at tailoring these sorts of things to your lodge, it's important to understand, why are things done the way they are currently? This was, potentially derived when we had less district deputy grand masters, before we had DEOs and things like that. That our traditions and the way that we practice them now come from something in the past. That our big lodge rooms that we have around the state of Ohio and other places, that back in the day we would have 100 people meeting, and that they developed good practices for when you had larger meetings. And that as time has gone on and we have smaller members, it does make sense to maintain the same level of maintaining those practices does make sense. If you have a lodge of 10 people and there's really about 4 people who work on committees, it doesn't really always make sense to assign a committee for every single interaction, when really 1 or 2 people can do it without having to involve everybody. Some of the other traditions that we have in Freemasonry that kind of build our group bonds deal with touch. So we have lots of traditions where we touch each other, right? So we have our handshakes. Within our ritual in Ohio, we pass the word in our Master Mason degree, which is, a fairly, which is a fairly intimate kind of connection with somebody. 5 points of fellowship are fairly, intrusive, right? It's not how I hug my friends, out in public, right? The point is that when we pass the word, it keeps us intimate, right? So we've seen that there are psychological studies that show that slow touch reduces social anxiety, particularly from ostracization. It lets people know that you are physically connected to them through touch, that they're not a threat, that they are part of your group. It also reduces social tensions. So when you go to shake somebody's hand or you're embracing them in a hug, it creates the potential for cognitive dissonance. So an example of this is the Benjamin Franklin effect. The Benjamin Franklin effect is from an anecdote where Benjamin Franklin was working in the colonial legislature, and he had run across a brother who was really not willing to work with him on any of this stuff. The guy seemed to hate him, right? And so Franklin needed to get his support. to get some legislation through. And so he thought of a way to do this. And he decided that he's going to ask him to borrow a book as a favor to him. And the guy was kind of put in a position where he couldn't really reject the request. So he let the guy let Franklin borrow the book. Franklin goes on to become, really, really good friends with this man through this kind of cognitive dissonance, which the Benjamin Franklin effect is more technically when you do something nice for someone, even if that person doesn't like you, they have to justify their behavior. And so what they do is they start liking you more as a result of it. It's a little bit, kind of tricky what Franklin did, but the idea is that when your actions and your thoughts don't align, you oftentimes will adjust the way that you think. And Freemasonry takes advantage of this by using a set of standard language, right? So we use the term brother, we use secret handshakes, we have certain interactions in lodge, like passing the word during opening, where people will start believing in the brotherhood because of the actions that they're taking, right? Because of this praxis.
Excuse me, Taylor, can you
Yep.
explain what a slow touch is? Just give me an example.
Yeah, sure. So slow touch is really just any touch that isn't like a quick. So if you look at, so basically like this, right? So like if like just touching somebody's hand, like leave it there for a second, or like moving kind of slowly rather than just like a quick like pat. There isn't really a time limit or anything on it. It's just kind of something that's a little bit slower. It isn't brief, really. So a good example is you can shake somebody's hand and real quick, and it's like 1 to 2 seconds. But if you look at our handshake in Freemasonry, it may be if you ever mentored a brother, you'll realize that it can be kind of awkward, particularly if you don't know that person that well. You're basically holding somebody's hand while you go through the modes of recognition. That's not a brief exchange, right? You're holding their hand for at least a minute or two. That's not something you're normally going to do with somebody that you don't like or you don't know very well. But by doing it with somebody who's new to the fraternity, you might not know so well, it kind of introduces you to them and kind of creates that bond. So one of the ways this works is that you have a lot of sensors on your body that pick up contact with another person that isn't the same as a lot of other interactions that we have with our physical world. That releases oxytocin, which is kind of what colloquially called the love molecule. So by having that kind of prolonged physical contact, it kind of creates that bond both chemically and kind of in that cognitive dissonance mode where you're saying, would I really, shake somebody's hand and hold it for this long if I didn't like them, or if I didn't know them, or if I didn't trust them that well, right? Hopefully that was a good explanation.
Okay, thank you.
And to define cognitive dissonance, according to the theory, there's a tendency for individuals to seek consistency among their cognitions, that is, beliefs, opinions, etc. When there is inconsistency between attitudes or behaviors, it creates dissonance, and that we kind of adjust one of our things, either our attitudes or our behaviors, to the other. It typically falls on attitudes. So what Freemasonry is doing by creating these physical interactions is changing our attitudes towards our brethren in a very literal sense. We also see this in traditions like the chain of union, where we essentially introduce touch amongst brothers and creating a physical representation of the chain of union. We also see this in our ritual as our guides take the candidate through the degrees, right? That this is a true and faithful brother that they can trust in. That we are both supplying a rationale for their trust and a way for that trust to be built kind of through how our bodies work. And this can also be seen in the 5 points of fellowship that we touched on earlier, that this is a relatively intimate hug, that each one of the points requires you to be in very close contact with somebody in those ways. Another thing that we do sonically is mimicry. So when people want to show that they're part of the group or identify with other people, one of the things that they do is they'll mimic their behaviors, right? So if I'm holding my chin like this, somebody who I'm talking to might do the same thing. They might adopt the same hand gestures, body poses, language. We see that a lot of groups wear the same clothes, for instance. But what it does is it helps people identify with each other, and it really works on the way that we kind of belong. And we do that in a number of ways in lodges. So within the lodge meeting, we have standard responses to the gavels. So if there are 3 knocks with the gavel, everybody stands up. We all salute at the same time. We all wear aprons. If you look at the festa board, there's toasting. It's also kind of there with singing that we kind of mimic our each other while we're singing. So if there's nobody's really singing very forcefully, everybody kind of just mumbles through the songs. But if one person starts singing louder, more enthusiastically, people tend to join in with it a lot more. So this is one of the ways that we kind of show the group interactions, right? And there's a lot of ways that we could build upon making this work in our lodge. For example, dress. It isn't necessarily required that we all wear suits, but by dressing the same manner, we all kind of act on the same level. We all agree that this is what we're participating in, and kind of shows that we're a solid group. You'll oftentimes find that when there are disagreements, a lodge will, wear their lodge polo, or they'll all wear maybe the same suit. So in Ohio, there's a group called the Society of Past Masters, and their uniform for a long time was black suit, black shirt, white tie. So they're distinct and people can identify them. A lot of lodges will oftentimes do that so that they can protect their kind of identity as a lodge. Within the lodge context, having similar dress does the same exact thing. It shows that you're part of the group, that you guys are all approaching this with kind of the same mentality and working together as a cohesive unit. We'll talk about that in our next slide. And within that, going back to that same sense of music and creating in group ideas quickly, you see that there is a rhythm to what we do in lodge. We have the same responses with the gavels. We have the same responses while we're doing opening and closing, and while we're doing toasting. Our degrees have a pattern and cadence to them that we all kind of participate in during the obligation, forming lines, for example. You oftentimes see it kind of spontaneously occur. For example, an MM degree, when there's chaos in kind of the temple, a lot of people do that kind of naturally, and they kind of work together doing those sorts of things. Some of the ways that we can kind of improve this idea of having a group identity by having cohesive, culture is that we can practice some of this stuff, right? So it's practicing as the craft team. In Ohio, we have 12 people on the craft team. We have to have coordinated movements around the lodge. That changes throughout our second degree. Practicing that helps create a kind of sense of camaraderie and identity, as well as making the degree look more impressive. We could do that saluting. Sometimes you'll see people in lodge kind of so out of cadence with each other, particularly when you have lots of different people from different lodges. Like at district meetings, that's more obvious at that point. You can see that in the same thing when we're doing toasts at festa boards, that it takes a little bit of practice to actually get the cannons to come down together in a nice, thunk on the table. But these are all things that can actually be practiced together. And again, with the dress code, you don't have to necessarily have a standard suit and tie as your uniform. You can do whatever works. Brother Cliff Porter out of Colorado was giving a lecture, and he brought up the importance of dress code, right? He was giving the lecture, and within the lecture, in the first row, there were like 10 or 12 Native American men there, and one of them stands up and said, "Look, dress code is all nice. However, I can't we're a lodge on the reservation. Our people don't have a lot of money. We can't ask people to go and buy a suit and tie. It's not something we can do. And Porter's response was that, look at your brother and the Native Americans, they were all dressed basically the same, right? It was black jeans, white collar shirt, black vest, right? Black leather vest. It's like, you already have a uniform. What is important about a uniform isn't that it's a suit or, coat and tails or, something like that. It's that everybody is kind of wearing the same thing and participates in the group activity, and they're not being outed or kind of pushed outside of the group based on their dress, whether or not that's intentional or not, right? Having a sense of unity is really what's important. And going back to all of this, it's as a whole, the effect is greater than the sum of its parts. We've probably all been there where, at High Point, we're not a super formal lodge. I've shown up in a suit where nobody else was. And it didn't really have the biggest effect on interactions, right? Same thing if, you show up in, a polo to a lodge and everybody else is in a suit, it doesn't necessarily going to impact the lodge that much. It's the totality of everything going on together, right? So that if there's a bunch of small little missteps and little things driving people apart, the effect is bigger than just one big thing. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. The main point of this is that it's important that we be all one mind, because when we're not, what we find is this. Is anybody familiar with the Lego movie? Yep. So and I think the Lego movie is possibly the best Masonic movie out there. There is a incident in the show where President Business is trying to glue all of the Legos together, and they're having a big meeting of the master builders, right? So there is Batman, Superman, all of the big shots in the Lego world, right? And they get attacked by President Business, and they all have to build a ship to get them out of trouble. And this is what they come up with. You have elements of a, '80s spaceship, the bat plane, rocks, pirate themed stuff, and a rainbow. And this was their escape vehicle, and it gets them away, but immediately breaks because none of this is built cohesively together. The only thing that doesn't break upon impact is this. This was built by the kind of everyman that's at the center of the show, which is on the top left, and his name is Everett. It's his friendship double-decker couch. He built this so that all of his friends could watch TV together. I think Masonically, that kind of speaks to what we do, is that when we build with this event of brotherly love, it's very strong, and it doesn't go there. But this was built with a single cohesive unit, and it protected them from the impact of running into the ocean. So when we have kind of this idea that we're all building and working on something together and following this, the master plan, right? We have a stronger, more cohesive and beautiful product than when we don't. We're going to move on now to another aspect of one of the traditions in Freemasonry that kind of impacts our sense of belonging, group identity, which is dinner. There's that saying, when we meet, we eat. Dinners have been a long-standing tradition in Masonic culture. The legend says that the reason Grand Lodge is formed is because people weren't holding the annual feast that they were promised, even going back to the Grand Lodge at York and so on. And dinner is really important because it builds those social bonds, and it's going to be more deeper and connected than you might get with something like singing. It's a common practice in many societies, in every society really, and also has that huge role in Freemasonry. We have our dedicated feast days, the Saint John, table lodges, and festive boards. One of the things that's really important about dinner is that it reduces people's perceptions of inequality. The diners tend to view those of different race, gender, socioeconomic backgrounds as more equal than they would have in other social scenarios. That eating really helps bring us all together as a group. when you look at older feast traditions across the world, you'll see is that there's oftentimes, the head of the table and lower people towards the other side, that your kind of rank in society can oftentimes be dictated of when and where you eat within that table. Masonically speaking, you can see when we look at our seating, that the way we format our table lodges to kind of bring inclusiveness to that kind of tradition, that in some
We seem to
Taylor,
have
you having a connection issue there? He froze and he's not speaking.
I think we can safely say that's the connection issue.
Yeah, I think so. Allegedly. All right. Hopefully it frees up. I'll give him a second. And he dropped. I guess he'll come back in. Hello to Michael and Ed and Chad, who keeps coming in and out. And Jose. I think Jose dropped though.
And happy Easter, Michael.
We lost Taylor.
Yep. I saw you come and go, Chad. Good to have you back with us.
I was running an errand, and then I got a phone call, and my fear was that being in the car, somehow I would press something and mess up
Okay.
something
Quite all right.
somehow. So,
Oh, good to have you with us.
but this is Taylor. Besides being a good friend, this is a good presentation, and it gives a lot of people a lot to think about. And every time I see him do it, I come away thinking something a little bit differently, or looking at things a little differently. So I'm looking forward to hearing him speak again. Hi, Taylor.
Right. Taylor, you were talking about dinners and you froze up there. I guess you dropped and came back in.
Yeah, it dropped me off the call. Sorry about that.
That's
I
quite
got
all right.
hungry and had to go get something to eat, apparently.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, whenever you're ready, Taylor, go ahead and take it away from. You were talking about dinners.
Yes.
Oh, did I? Oh, sorry. I muted you. I think I muted you. I was trying to shut up everybody else.
No.
Try again. There we go. I tend to do that. Like, let me shut up everybody else so the speaker can talk, and I end up turning off the speaker.
All right. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay.
You were on the last bullet point.
Last bullet point.
Oh, I saw temperature is important. You didn't mention that when you were talking about it.
Yeah. So let's go back to that. So with temperature, temperature. Yeah, we'll go ahead and talk about this now. So temperature has an effect on how we kind of view what's going on around us. In that when we're eating dinner, it's typically better to have a hot meal because it plays on that aspect of communal warmth that we're doing. That an easy dinner is usually something like cold cut sandwiches or something like that. They don't tend to have the same level of impact on what we're doing culturally within our lodge meetings. Is that the hot dinners have that what we're doing here is important, that we've put in the time to create a warm meal for everybody to participate in. We're going to talk about the idea of temperature on the next slide too. And the last point for dinner is that the University of Oxford did some studies where they found that people, when they eat with others, are more likely to feel happy and satisfied with their lives. And one of the things that we're doing at dinner is creating that sense of social connection with people, that they are, are equals and we're on the level. And this really helps bring about a sense of happiness and satisfaction in life. That we're paired well together with the way that our events like table lodges are set up. Really creates a sense of that equality is something that is good, that brings us happiness. And to continue on with the notion of temperature, warm temperatures are associated with quote warm feelings. For instance, there was another study that found that people seated in a warm room report feeling closer to the experimenter than when compared to sitting in a cold room. Imagine sitting in a cold doctor's office compared to a warm doctor's office. You might feel closer to your doctor in those situations. And when you combine those two ideas that warm feelings are associated with closer interpersonal connection with people, the physical warmth produced concomitant feelings of social warmth. This idea is that going back to eating something like a hot meal, it makes you feel warm, or something that's a little spicy. It helps people feel kind of bonded together. If it's the middle of winter and you're coming in from a snowy cold night, and lodge has a nice big hot pot of chili and everybody's kind of eating together, it creates a stronger sense of community and good pleasant feelings. This idea also goes back and forth. So it goes back and forth, that mind-body connection we talked about, social or cognitive dissonance, that when you can actually reverse these orders, right? So you can use a behavior to induce a feeling, or you can have a feeling induce a behavior. That the same sort of experiments showed that physically induced experience of closer social proximity or warmth produces changes in the estimated temperatures of the room. So people were feeling like there was together and close together. They thought the room was higher in temperature, right? So that the relationship between room temperature, body temperature, and emotional temperature are fairly closely related. Again, this isn't a single point that would define the Masonic experience. That if having a hot room doesn't necessarily make everybody feel more closely connected with each other. It's combining this with a lot of the Masonic practices that we do that really gets this kind of together, and picking the right set of practices across the gamut of everything that we do really produces those powerfully socially connected bonds that we look for in Freemasonry that makes us legendary. And you can find that a lot of our practices do this intentionally. That if you look at the Table Lodge, it incorporates many of these principles into one event, right? So you have toast, which has this mimicry to it. It has this rhythm. You have U-shaped seating, which really puts people closer together inside of each other, promotes conversation. You have this kind of close connection with people. Typically, people are pretty close together at the dining table. It's typically kind of fun. So you have this kind of engaging practice of creating social bonds through the activities of like singing, toast. There's usually some kind of presentation. There's usually some jokes that go along with it, where people are laughing and they're engaging very positively in this experience. And I'm going to note here that this offers a foil to the seriousness of Lodge, that if lodges are supposed to be solemn, and what we're doing is sacred in some sense, right? Dealing with the Table of Solomon, that we have a foil for that seriousness in the Table Lodge, where it's kind of fun and convivial, and everybody's having a good time in a very wholesome way. We're going to talk about seating, because seating is really important in what we do Masonically. There's a lot of different ways that we kind of look at how we seat each other. So there are a lot of studies that show seating interactions. Seating arrangements affect interactions. It's kind of obvious when you think about it, that if everybody's facing a lecturer, that they are going to focus on that lecture. when we look at how our lodge is formatted, we'll see that in the next slide, visually looking, that it's kind of obvious what our lodges are focused on and centered on how practice function. But for seating, there are a few things that really matter, which is one, proximity, again, shape, and then appearances, right? So when we look at our seating arrangements and how many people are there, it tells us some information about it, the room and the meeting, that impacts how we kind of view it, and how we view it that way impacts us socially and our bonds with each other. So if you look at this chart here, we have 4 different standard seating arrangements for classrooms. Does anyone want to take a hazard a guess at what the lodge room is mostly seated like? No. So our lodge rooms are typically seated like this, right? This is kind of set up for Socratic discussions, where everybody's facing each other and every guy can participate in the meeting. In a lot of lodge rooms, you might see a little disconnect between the corners over here, particularly where the treasurer sits. There's not usually people sitting with the worshipful master, not too many people sitting up there. But this shape really is focused on the center. And Masonically speaking, that is the altar, but it also allows for open discussion on the floor where everybody kind of interacts with each other. If we were to move to something like this, which is what the original Civil War Symposium was structured as, is a lecture hall where everybody is focused on the lecture up here. This reduces interaction between participants sitting in the audience. In the lower right, we see that these tables are set up for group interactions, for small groups, 4-piece here. And here it's set up, this is our table I've set up, right? That there's a prisoner up here, and you have a hybrid with the open discussion formatting of the lodge format up here, that it gives us something to focus on, dinner, presenter, etc. But it still maintains that ability to discuss across the channels that we see here. So one of the things that we do, and this is where we're going to start talking about appearance, is that the way that we structure our lodge physically really impacts what's going on. So proximity is important. When you look at studies on friendship, what you find is that people who are close together tend to form friendships, right? So there's studies that looked at college dorms, neighborhoods, work friends. People who sit together physically tend to become friends because they interact with each other more. The people who form the closest friendships in their college dorms usually have rooms that are pretty close together, if not adjacent to each other. You tend to be closer with your neighbors who are right next door to you, or pretty closer on your street than somebody half across the neighborhood. And same thing with work friends, right? You're most likely to be friends with somebody who sits with you or works closely with you in your office. So this idea is that the closer we are to people physically, the more likely we are to make bonds with them. Now, we can't make everybody move together into one neighborhood from lodge. That probably wouldn't be good for the fraternity because it would kind of reduce our social network and our ability to grow as a fraternity by reducing the social network of our individual members. But you do want people to sit together, closely. It builds that sense of camaraderie. If you want to know who's friends with who in a lodge, look who they sit with, right? Pretty obvious. If you're, in a high school, you can tell, what friend groups exist by, who's sitting next to each other. And in lodge, one of the problems we run into is that there are oftentimes too many seats in our lodge rooms. So Brother Dougherty's lodge room that he meets in, I think, holds like 320, 350 people. There's a little balcony above the lodge that holds, like 20 additional folks. If the lodge is full. But the distance between the worshipful mass and the senior warrant is pretty extensive. That where people sit is potentially isolating, right? So the treasurer sits off to the, northeast corner of the lodge. Not a lot of people might sit up there with him. The socially isolates them. It's harder to hear people when they're further away, particularly with older members, and makes them maybe feel isolated. In fact, their studies show that people who have hearing problems are less likely to socialize, and have difficulty socializing with other people because it's hard to communicate. That when you have lower social interactions, people actually live shorter lives. But one of the things that we accidentally do is that when we have these really large lodge rooms, is that they tend to isolate us in a lot of ways. And that's maybe something that's potentially hard to deal with, just because you can't physically move some of the bench seating that we have in the lodge rooms. But there are a couple of things that we could do to address that. Besides the actual physically isolating people and potentially making it harder for them to hear and interact with other members of the lodge, it also provides the appearance that people are potentially disconnected from each other. That creates sometimes potentially the opportunity for people to view others as oppositional to them. If you're sitting across the table with somebody, not next to them, you tend to engage in more confrontational behavior. And when you have a really empty lodge room, even if you have an increase of membership, and you're, say you had 13 members coming and now you have 50 members coming, in a large lodge room that fits 300 people, it's still going to feel empty. It's going to feel like there's a reduction in the growth and gains that the lodge has had, right? One of the things that I've thankfully I don't have to deal with this issue much longer, but one of the things when I first joined Freemasonry was there was people in our lodge room who our lodge sits comfortably about 50 people, who are very actively always asking, how do we get more people in here? How do we get more people in here? If we add 5 active new members a year, and even doubled our lodge size, our lodge room would still feel empty, and there would still feel this pressure to that we need to have more members because we're not fulfilling what we should be doing by not filling the seats. But there are a couple ways we can deal with this, and particularly deal with the appearance of an empty lodge room, even when that's really not the case. I could bring 300 Masons to a football stadium, and they all sit far apart. That stadium's going to be empty, right? One of the things to do is reduce what are the physical impact of having a lot of empty seats and staying far away from people are. So to do that, what we could do is, if you have the option, remove some of the seats that aren't there, right? You can move the seats inward, so that instead of sitting apart, 50 feet from each other against the walls of the lodge room, just move the seats closer to the altar. Bring the stations closer to the altar if you can, and focus your attention on a more narrow set of space. One of the benefits of doing this is that the lodges physically closer together. You're more focused on each other, physically closer, but it does require tear up and tear down. And there's sometimes lodges you can't do that. Their chairs are bolted to the ground. You don't want to risk carrying down a 200-pound chair down a flight of stairs, things like that. Well, other things you could do is you could rope off sections of your lodge, so that it signals to people visually that these seats aren't supposed to be filled, and that's okay. A lot of lodges actually did this with COVID, and it forced people to kind of sit closer. No, actually, that's actually not true. They didn't sit closer together, but it gave a sense that a lot of the lodge room wasn't as empty as they thought it was, because the way the chairs were roped off. One thing is to ask people to sit next to each other, or sitting close to somebody, so that they don't feel isolated, or use assigned seatings. Excuse me. For example, there's a lot of lodges have a tradition of placing entered apprentices in the northeast corner of the lodge, having fellow crafts, sit in the south, and the master masons, if they want to, that you could assign seating to people so that they both know where to go. There isn't any kind of issues with new people coming in and not feeling accepted within the lodge, or feeling cliquey or anything like that. That you can mix the seats up intentionally so that you kind of create the social atmosphere that you're looking for. The other side is actually just getting a smaller lodge room. A lot of our lodge buildings are kind of
albatrosses around our neck that we really struggle with maintaining the building. There's a lot of fighting about what to do with it, things like that. And historically speaking, our lodge rooms were rather small. It was only really within to the 1920s and in the 50s that we started building these larger lodge rooms. Doing idea growth and membership, the growth in membership and the way that we run our lodge is a result of the Baltimore conventions and some of these other impacts on our lodges, where we changed the way that we were operating because of fear of the anti-Masonic parking, these sorts of things, and in response to the Morgan affair, where we stopped forming new lodges. Historically, that the rate of new lodges being formed in the United States dropped while our membership was increasing, and that this resulted in a change in a lot of our practices and what we do, and that the lodges of those time periods adopted their practices to fit their larger membership size, right? So you'd see the formation of lunch clubs, of companies forming craft teams or Masonic groups themselves. So in our area, there's a steel plant that had Masons who'd meet at lunchtime. They all work together on degree work and memorization and things like that. Certain companies tended to go to certain lodges. You might have a lodge that has a group that ran, the lodge dinners, another group who did the craft team, and all these other things. You form these, what we can think of as mini lodges within larger lodge apparatus. And we built lodge rooms to accommodate that increased number of people within a lodge. If we go look at lodges, on the older side, you'll find that they tended to not be so big. So this is an image of Butlerville Lodge 135, built in 1846. It's an Ohio lodge. It's one of the oldest operating buildings for lodges in Ohio, and it fits maybe 13 people comfortably. It is so small that when they do inspections, that they have to actually they only do the entered apprentice degree. In Ohio, every year we assess a different degree for inspections. They have to actually rent out a firehouse and do the other degrees at the firehouse. And when they do their public inspection, it's always an entered apprentice degree. And it's oftentimes very packed. But if you look at other lodges across the world, this was also built in the late 1800s, Coney Zero or not. It holds about 30 people. That this used to be the size of a standard lodge, and a lot of our practices are kind of fit towards that. If we are experiencing, a decrease in membership, having a smaller lodge room has the benefits of making it easier to have proximity and the appearance of the things that we kind of want. And it was 1893 is when it was built. So when we're looking at practices of what we can do, we really want to make sure that we want to make the room do more for us and not kind of take away from our experiences. A lot of these magnificent rooms can have a grand sense of grandeur. It can be a small lodge room that has a very high sense of intimacy, or emptiness even. But what these rooms have is they do have an effect on the overall mood of the meeting. And we want to make sure that the way that we're interacting with our lodge rooms, regardless of seating, has an empowerment. And it has an impact on us. So we can apply things like the endowment effect. This is the idea that people put more value in things just because they own it, right? If I have a cup, I might put more value on that cup than I would actually pay for it, right? So say, take this mug right here, say somebody gave this mug to me. I might say, I think this is a $40 mug. Since they gave it to me, or someone wanted to buy this mug for me, I wouldn't sell for less than $40. But if I was going to buy it, I might not be willing to pay more than $20 to actually get it. And so there's a discrepancy between the value placed on things is higher just because we own it. And conversely, that people will pay more to keep something that they own than they would to actually just go out and buy it, even if it's not something that was special to them or that has sentimental value. that we just tend to value things that we own and don't like the idea of loss. And loss, the threat of loss is really drives a lot of kind of behavior and how we approach things. People tend to be very risk averse. So what we can do is we can invest in our lodge space. So we can apply this endowment effect idea that we do see it across the United States, that there are many handcrafted pieces of furniture, of altars. There are pictures. There are little knickknacks that people have brought into the lodge and acquired for the lodge. And it tells us that these Masons invest in what they love. But also by investing in our spaces, we tend to become more connected to them. With the building issues that we face today, sometimes this endowment effect is more problematic, that we're more willing to pay a lot of money to keep the lodge building than we would be to originally buy it, for example. But what we can do is we can apply this effect in lodges, that by asking people to invest in the lodge or contribute to something to the lodge or have a sense of ownership, they'll have more attachment to it. Some examples of what this looks like. It's putting a mural on the wall, having somebody build furniture, putting in stained glass windows, or we had a lodge member at High Point buy a set of candelabra so you could do candlelight degrees. There's a lot of ways that people can do this. The idea is that we want to reinforce the idea that the lodge is something special. It's not just mundane, and that we like it enough to invest in it. On the same note, it's important to understand that when we're trying to make the room do more, that there is essentially a trade-off in cost, right? That again, the size matters. At High Point, we can light our lodge room with candelabras. And Brother Dougherty's lodge, I don't think it would take a lot of time. I don't think there'd be enough time to light it, right? So a relatively smaller lodge room, we can light our 4 candelabras. It takes maybe about 15 minutes to get them all lit. To do that for a lodge the size of the Hamilton Masonic Temple would potentially take a lot longer, a lot higher fire risk and stuff like that. But you can still maybe potentially do something else. You could have strategic gas lamps, or a smaller number of candles in certain places, potentially fake candles that are controlled, wirelessly through Bluetooth or something like that. You can get better bulbs. You could use tapers around the altar. You can use all kinds of things. The idea is that, again, if we're saying that size matters, and we have to acknowledge that some of the activities that we do are impacted by size. That one tradition doesn't always work in another place because of these very physical limitations that we might always realize. This is a picture from Blackmore Lodge 129. This lodge was completely renovated a few years ago. They have these beautiful Masonic murals on the wall, hand painted. You can only see a little bit on the floor. They have a blazing star inlaid into the floor. They have the skylight. Every one of those little pinpoints for the stars is the actual sky map of the night the lodge was founded. They have this beautiful faux stained glass window. And this is a modern renovation of a lodge that was really well thought out, well executed, and it took the lodge a lot of time to invest in their lodge. And sometimes we say this, that we should be investing in our lodge buildings or what we're doing here. A lot of times people will kind of say, we don't have the funds for that, or it's not worth it. There's not a lot of value in it. Why would we spend $5,000 adding into this lodge room when the walls are white or light blue and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing really else going on in the lodge room. Again, they get a lot of value out of beautifying their space. When you walk in this lodge room, it feels special. You think that what you're going to do in this lodge room is something important. The degree of work is impacted by the beauty of the room that they're in. And just more on this, that this lodge is located in a small town. It's back down in the center of the Uwharrie National Forest. It is not a big city, high profile lodge where, everybody's lawyers and doctors. The things that we can do as a fraternity, even in small country lodges like Blackmer, is extensive. It just takes, effort, time, and people have to care enough to do that. People care enough about Blackmer because the lodge does a lot of good practices, that the things that they're doing all together have a high impact on their membership. No one of the things we've talked about tonight are going to have, is a silver bullet. It's the whole system. It's making sure what we're doing fits together holistically. That, it's building a Masonic culture that people identify with. And culture is built up by small repeated actions, that when you have the impact of a small things oftentimes is greater than a large thing, right? So emotionally speaking, one massive negative event or positive event has less impact on somebody's life than a series of small negative events that are repeated for a long time. So, losing, $10,000 once is not going to be as life altering as a lot of people think it would be. Emotionally speaking, that the emotional impact is going to maybe be severe but short lived. It's when there are a bunch of small losses, right? You lose $100 at a time, but you lose $100 every single day. The negative impact never has time to reset and re-equilibrate downward. It just continues building up. And the same thing positively. One really great Masonic event is not going to change a lodge culture or a lodge's trajectory. But a lot of small positive events will. And it's building up that progression over time and repeatedly doing it. Singing once or holding one table lodge isn't going to change your lodge culture. It's the repeated actions of what we're doing. So in closing, the things to do, right? We should follow our Masonic traditions, but make sure they fit our lodges. That, we used to do things in the past we stopped doing because we got too big or we got too small and it makes sense to do them anymore. We can bring those back if we understand when and why they changed. We want to make sure that the brotherhood that we're building is intimate, that we know the people we're in lodge with, and that we feel connected to them and that they feel connected to us. That the Masonic bonds that we form are really, really close. If there's one thing that I learned about reading Michael Howard's book, the speaker we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, is that during the Civil War, Masons felt highly connected to men that they had never met before, going so far as to trust their lives with people on a handshake. From stopping battle to bury somebody. There was an example of a gunship that was exchanging fire with the coast. One of the principal officers that was a Mason. The lodge in the South came out and buried him. Right, they stopped their hostilities to bury him. There are examples of a Union soldier who'd go around and ask other Masons for food in the South, across hostile lines, that the Southerners were willing to give him food for, based on their Masonic connection, right, which is potentially treasonous. Is that if people in the past had these strong bonds, it's because they built them, and we should be building them in the same way. If there are a lot of people in attendance, we might want to use subtle clues that everybody's working together. The impact of having a dress code or standard traditions and ways to interact as a group has probably a higher impact in creating group identity there and unity. In a smaller lodge, it might make sense to keep people closer together in those places. That might have a bigger impact on lodge health. But it's also important to get buy-in from the brothers and experiment and adapt our traditions that are adaptable to what we're doing. What we want to avoid is that sense of looking empty or desolate or broken down. We want to avoid being physically distant and isolated. And really, we want to make sure we're not killing the vibe of the lodge. That if there's a positive, good meeting going on, that we don't distract from that, or if everybody got really happy singing about something, that we don't go in and ruin that mood. All right, that is in my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Brother Taylor. I just had a comment. You mentioned the size of the lodge room. My Scottish Rite Valley used to meet at Granby Street in Norfolk, which was huge building. And incidentally, that building, they had a temple committee that manages the overall operation. You had anywhere from 8 to 12 lodges have met there over the years. There are 3 lodge rooms, and they're cinder block. They're all painted like light blue, but the lodges are not allowed to put up anything inside the lodge rooms because every lodge room shared among multiple lodges. But part of the culture of having basically a group or a committee that ran the whole building is there was no individuality. And the usual expression is, it's like, oh, you're one of the lodges on Granby Street. They're not allowed to personalize their lodge rooms. Now that's changed a little over the years, but the Scottish Rite had the room. So I'll just set the tone that this is a 2-story building that had at one time 10 or 11 lodges that met there, 3 lodge rooms, a Job's Daughters room, a Commandery room, a Royal Arch room, a De Malay room, a Eastern Star and Amaranth room, and a Scottish Rite room. And then you had an auditorium with a lifted stage and a huge dining hall. So it was huge. The Scottish Rite had a room that could seat, I'd say, 300 people, maybe more. The Scottish Rite realized, because you had all the way at the east, you had the presiding officer, and all the way in the west, you had those officers. So it's at least, I don't know, 20, 30 feet across, and I don't know how, I'm not a good distance, say 100 feet wide or long. They took all of the officer chairs and brought them down to the midpoint where the altar normally was, just a little over halfway, and moved the altar down towards the west. It was still wide, but everybody was sitting in basically half of the room. And that did a lot to bring everyone together. And, it's like we felt closer. Also, the room that we had, the dining hall, picture a high school cafeteria where you had the walls that, fold out and separate the room up. Imagine a high school cafeteria that seats 400 people. Now imagine you're in a lodge like my mother lodge that had maybe 10, 15 people at a meeting. You're sitting at one of the long tables, at one table out of the 4 or 5 in that row, out of the 8 rows of tables in the room. You sit down to have a little refreshment after the meeting. It's no wonder people stuck around like 10 minutes and they bailed, because you're in this tiny corner of this huge room. Now, we didn't have it set up. They've changed it. They've changed a lot of things, and they put in more round tables, so it's better. In my current lodge, Ocean View, we have what we call the man cave. So picture a typical lodge building, has an upstairs that's the lodge room and the ante room, and then maybe a bathroom, and then downstairs you have the ladies' bathroom, and you have the dining hall and the kitchen on the ground floor. We took about a fourth of the room in the dining hall, got a bunch of big love seats and comfortable chairs, and sectioned that off, put up a TV that nobody uses, but it's there. And we sit in that area after the meeting. It's called the man cave. That encourages us to stick around and socialize, and we'd spend hours after our meetings there. So I definitely have seen some of the ideas you brought up put into practice.
Yeah, there's a lodge in Ohio, Arts and Sciences. When they first formed, they would actually do the same thing where everybody would basically take their chair. They'd form the lodge right around the altar, and just use a spotlight to highlight the altar, and that would provide enough light for everybody around it. And they had a lot more intimate lodge room experience doing that. And for some of these really huge rooms, when you do that, if the spotlight's bright enough or big enough, you can kind of black out the rest of the room so that you don't really see how empty it is, and you're focused really right there on each other. Lodge. But a lot of lodges have tried it and loved it.
Ed asked a question in the chat. This will be put out on YouTube fairly soon. So you'll be able to see the whole thing. If you want to ask Brother Taylor to email you the PowerPoint, he might make that available. But the entire presentation, I'm going to edit out a few sections, but
Okay.
the whole presentation will be available on YouTube here to go back and watch. Chad,
Cool.
you had a question?
Sort of two comments, and it'll go into a question. Why not? So, one of the things that I really appreciate about your presentation is I think that many lodges kind of get on this idea that they have to do big, huge, sweeping things to affect lodge culture. That, you know, it's whatever. But you seem to stress the importance of just it's small things. It's just being intentional about something. You know, one of the examples you and I have talked about in the past is, and I say all the time, is the master and the senior warden standing outside the lodge room, welcoming people in, like shaking their hands as they come in, you know, greeting them by name, just setting that tone, just setting that, you know, that as guys come in, as from a lodge management standpoint, they can kind of, you know, see what's happening in the meeting. But just as a brother, as you walk in, there are the two main officers of the lodge welcoming you by name, saying, yep, why don't you go sit over by that person? They're that small little thing that costs them nothing, changes what happens within a lodge.
Hey, Chad, if I could make a
Yep.
comment on that, and that's a great idea. The reality is almost every lodge meeting I've been to, and maybe this is just something we should be doing better at planning stuff. The worship master is usually spending the 15 minutes before the meeting getting everything ready, getting ready to start the meeting. He doesn't have time to stand there. And as much as that's a good idea, the reality is usually the master is running around trying to fill the chairs because the senior deacon didn't show, so he's got to find someone to fill in, and going over the agenda. Honestly, the master is usually getting ready to start the meeting right before the meeting starts. But that's the reality. Now, maybe we should change that, but that's probably why they wouldn't do that.
But I think that one of the things that Taylor is saying in his presentation, and I don't put words in his mouth because I think he's sick and has a sore throat, and I'll put words in his mouth anyway,
Okay.
Is that, you know, just doing those sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, it's tough and it doesn't always work. But I got to be honest, if those small things, they make it so guys actually want to come back to lodge. If I knew coming into lodge that somebody gave 2 squirts that I was there, enough to shake my hand and greet me by name and say, you know what, I'm glad you're here.
Now,
I don't know.
I will
might feel a little
say
bit more connected, a little bit better than if, you know, otherwise.
well, I will say this, like because we typically serve a dinner before the meeting, the master, usually the officers and usually the master makes an effort to go around and greet everybody at the dinner. So they do kind of, it's not, when we get ready to start the actual meeting, I think it's hard, but they do make a point during dinner to walk around and say hi to everybody and welcome everybody. So we can accomplish that if we have the dinner hour, because then there's a little more flexibility. And then when it starts getting close to the meeting, that's when you don't see the master until the meeting starts. But yes, I make a point when I go to a lodge, I shake hands with everybody there. That's just me. I walk around and meet everybody, but
And
I think we should
this
always
is sort of, and this is sort of my question for Taylor. You know, again, we've had this conversation. Coming from a theater background where they were telling us that an audience's experience starts when they pull their car into the driveway, in the parking lot, right? It can get it's really easy at times to kind of get lost in the weeds, right? You spend so much time focusing on creating the perfect experience, you kind of forget about, you know, the play. I guess what thoughts would you have for a lodge? Like, how do you avoid that trap of, or how do you know when it's enough, you know? Or is it sort of, it depends.
I don't have an answer for that.
You're good.
Because
okay, next question.
No, like that's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Chad's wrong. That's my only opinion. I'm kidding.
There we go.
Well, no, I mean that's important to understand because there are lodges who adopt some of the big grand changes that we're talking about, right? So tuxes, you know, festive boards, you know, with
multi-course meals, and that still end up struggling, right? Because they're still missing something somewhere along the lines. And I don't, and this is really why I kind of like using complexity theory to approach Freemasonry, is that complexity theory is this idea that there are complex dynamic systems that are constantly adapting, right? So we all adapt to what other people are doing in our group, right? When we interact with each other, right? That's what makes predicting what humans do really hard, just because we're all kind of making an assumption about somebody else. They're making an assumption about what we're going to do, and we make an assumption about what they think we're going to do, and it goes on and on and on, so that it becomes really kind of impossible to predict things. But within this idea of complexity theory is this, the edge of chaos. The edge of chaos is a space between, a chaotic system and a highly ordered system that is dynamic, right? So a highly ordered system, everything is exactly the same all the time, basically dead. In a really chaotic system, things might create and destroy and fizzle out really, really quickly. And then there's kind of nothing, right? But at the edge of chaos, there's enough stability and enough chaos that things can kind of grow. And this is where some of these computer models develop this sense of being alive, right? That the traditions that we have, we can't be too static, we can't be too chaotic, where every lodge meeting, I'm gonna walk in the room, I don't know where, things are gonna be or what I'm gonna have to do, right? Nothing's worse than going to lodge and you have no idea what chair you're gonna sit in, but you're gonna sit in some chair. Don't know the degree, don't know what part of the work you're doing, but you're just gonna be thrown somewhere completely chaotically. It's kind of stressful for people. Conversely, though, if you're going to lodge and you're going to sit in the same chair and you're not going to do anything different, it's going to be the same bills you paid last month, the same bills you paid 3 years ago, same bills you're going to pay in 5 years. There's not really anything there, right? That you do need this kind of active engagement. So while I don't know of when to say it's done, it's never done, is that we're going to be adapting to what's going on in our lodge room, changes in membership, changes in code or society, technology, that we always have to kind of engage in that activity of building what we're doing. That
Well, right, because any innovation you have, if it's not intentional or justified or revisited, then a year from now it becomes, well, we've always done that. It goes right back into that same trap. So, that's kind of what you're saying. Like, it should always be a constant reassessment, reevaluation, reinvigoration of, why we do what we do. Is that?
Yeah. And there's, I think the author of Built to Last uses the phrase, preserve the core, stimulate innovation, right? That is that there is a core of what you want to preserve in your culture. But part of that culture might not actually be, not everything is part of that core, right? So if your lodge always has dinner before lodge, and that's really important, that's something you want to preserve, great. Doesn't mean you have to have the same exact dinner every night, or that what you're preserving isn't really, you have to have green beans made with this one recipe. Right?
I was going to say, you have to have green beans.
Yeah,
that's
you
what
can have green beans,
means.
but yeah, but you can change some of there are parts of the thing that we're looking at that can change, right? So my chair just unlocked. Some of the stuff that we can change might be how we do business, right? So you can maybe use committees more or less in lodge to facilitate what you want to do. You might use a consent agenda or not. You might use email communications or an app. You could even use a voting app potentially, right, in lodge. Well, I think in Ohio our code says you have to use voice calls, or there's certain ways you have to ballot, right? But oftentimes that some of those things that we're preserving is the form and not the function. You can preserve the function of what you're doing and change the form, right? So that if what you're doing is communication, it might be better to not use an auto dial system and just send out an email, or instead of sending a snail mail or having you use email or an auto dial system or a text system. You know, one of my lodges uses GroupMe for most of our communication now. That what we care about isn't necessarily some of the stuff that we preserve, right? That, you know, the way we always did it isn't really what matters. It doesn't really matter that, you know, at High Point we have a farmer's night. It doesn't really matter that we had cornbread and beans. That's not really part of it's not the most critical part of that tradition, right?
It was, Taylor, it was the custom in the Virginia area, well, the Hampton Roads area anyway, as recently as, I guess, maybe in the 2000s, we stopped doing this. Lodges would put a notice in the paper, in the classifieds, saying our lodge. They've stopped that. I don't know if anyone even gets a paper anymore, but that was the way people were notified. David had his hand up for a while. I want to make sure he got his question in.
Yeah, what I really originally raised my hand for and what I want to talk about now may be two completely different things, but you know, welcome to my brain. I mean, first thought was, I mean, kind of building on what Taylor was just saying, is the whole complexity theory, complex adaptive systems and so forth. As some of you know, as I've discussed on here before, I teach university biochemistry and so forth, and that is a world of adaptive systems. That's just what it is. And I think one of the things that is often difficult for a lot of people to grasp about these complex systems, which is important for Lodge, I think, is that there is no target. You know, it's the idea that you're always trying to hit a moving target, right? What is optimal today may not be optimal next month or a year from now or 10 years from now. So this concept of, well, that's the way we've always done it, implies that you're missing the target most of the time. So not only do you have to keep changing, or, you know, do you need to keep coming up with new ideas, it's not like you're ever going to get the right answer. You're going to get the best answer for right now. The other side of that is, and I think this is kind of what Taylor was getting into, was big changes are great. But with this idea of thinking of the Lodge as part of a complex system, is that most often what brings the greatest success in a complex system are very small changes, and changes that you can't predict until you've actually observed them. So, you know, the idea of, you know, somebody saying, well, we tried that before, it didn't work. Well, maybe you didn't try it the same way. Maybe it's a different group of people. Who knows? So, I mean, this idea of the Lodge as a complex system is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and it actually kind of fits in. And so that kind of gets me to my original question. I've seen Taylor give this presentation a few times. He and I have talked about it privately a few times and whatever. And every time, you know, like in most presentations, every time I pick up something new. So that was something that kind of picked up on me this time. The original comment that I was going to make, though, was that the most important thing I think I got from any time I've heard this presentation was what I refer to, and this isn't going to be this is not a secret phrase or anything, but the idea of love the one you're with, right? How many times have you shown up to a lodge and you spend the first 10 minutes complaining, you hear people spend the first 10 minutes complaining about so-and-so's not here, we're missing these people, and they talk about the 20 people that aren't there. Well, when you're one of the 10 that did show up, it's really disheartening to realize that your attendance is less important than somebody else's absence. So I try, and I use this not only in masonry, but in school and everything else. I try to, say, we're going to go with what we've got. And, and to Taylor's point, if that means you need to change the room to fit the group you have, then do it. Because those people that actually showed up are the most important people. And that's, I think, what we often miss. Now, I do actually have a question. Taylor, you have given this many times. We've talked about it many times. What do you think is the most impactful change that you have made in your lodge or in a lodge as a result of these conversations and these presentations?
Well, I'm gonna go back to something you said earlier before I answer that question. To that concept of there's a really I love the book. It's called Finite and Infinite Games by a guy named Case. And in this book, he lays out this approach where There are finite games like chess where there are set rules. There's a end point, a starting point, and there's a winner and a loser, and infinite games. And in infinite games, the point of an infinite game is to kind of always keep playing. So it's like running a business, right? The point of running a business is to always stay in business, not make $1 million and game over. It's to continue being in business. One of the things that we kind of need to think about at Lodge is that the point of a lodge isn't to win at being a lodge. It's to keep being a lodge and doing what you're doing. There isn't a perfect number of Masons to get to, or there's not a I made 100 Masons this year. Now we win the game Masonry. Like, that's not how that game works. And so that I think that's kind of a really important idea, is that sometimes a lot of the ways that modern man has taken approach to life is very finite. It's very constrained. It's very limited in its impact, and that Freemasonry as an infinite game is a lot more powerful, and that the experiences of these infinite games are more powerful and more critical to the human experiences. That we can play finite games within the infinite game of life, but you can't play an infinite game within a finite game. That one is kind of more supersedes the other, and that by taking this kind of infinite game approach to what we do as Masons, it's generally just kind of a better way to live our life. John?
Paul first, then me. So
Yeah, Paul had a question.
More of a comment when you're talking about lodge space. If you notice in large churches, cathedrals of the liturgical variety, that they will often have a side chapel for smaller get-togethers or weekday services. And so that's their answer to spaces. And so that's how they handle it, by having a separate space that's smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Just an observation. My lodge rents from another lodge, and so there's not a lot of decorating we can do. But after they're renovating the restrooms with new partitions and everything, spruce it up. We decided to help them with that financially. And so instead of going up, we didn't want the rent to go up, but we felt that those renovations, reflected on our lodge visitors as well as the lodge that we rent from. And also, after one of the hurricanes, we had some water come in from the roof, and the ceiling suspended, and so we paid for the replacement of the ceiling tiles for them. So even though we don't own the space, we've helped them out with it because we know it reflects on our lodge.
And on that same note, so the smaller enclave for the church, that comedy clubs take this idea of proximity really seriously, so that within the comedy club world, they want to have the smallest amount of space being used as they can, right? So what they'll do is they typically tend to be pretty small. They tend to force everybody to sit close together, even if they have plenty of room. I went to a comedy club with some friends. They had about 30 people at the show, and they had all the tables pretty much, they had just enough space for you to walk by, and you're probably going to bump into somebody. And they had all the tables set right around the stage like that. And then like 60% of the venue was actually closed off, right? They turned off the lights, they moved the chairs up, they moved everything back so that everybody was kind of focused directly on the stage and really close together. And that the closer people are at a comedy show, the more likely they are to laugh, and laugh more vigorously. So a lot of groups have used that size to kind of impact what they do all the time. And in Freemasonry, we used to too. It's just that we built these really big lodge rooms, and there's a point that hit in in the 80s, I think, really it was the 80s and the 90s, where we kind of stopped adapting, and then kind of got really set in our ways. I think it's probably the result of business management practices being imported into Freemasonry that really kind of put a damper on stuff and put a damper on American the economy too. And you see a lot of these changes being pushed in the 2000s into now. The guys like Simon Sinek and some of the new management gurus, where they really talk about purpose and this stuff. If you look at a group like the PMI, Project Management Institute, the way that we've switched from this command and control concept to this much more kind of spread out and self-organized management structure in a lot of projects. That's much more flexible than what you see in the past, like Agile and Scrum, compared to the waterfall. You do this and this and this kind of project management stuff.
Taylor, you and I agree on this, like, doing a whole conference about this whole idea of like being intentional with masonry. You talk about business practices. I mean, it really was in the 80s, there was almost that franchise model of masonry that like we will all do the same things in, our lodges at the same time. And there is that push sort of against that. But doesn't that kind of become then incumbent upon Grand Lodge to actually, foster and support that idea of a lodge identifying their values and what's important to them and creating that kind of experience? The problem is that that's not something that a Grand Master can very easily put on their yearly allocution. Like, it's not a hard number like a membership statistic or a, whatever. That's hard to measure, isn't it? Like, if we do this kind of individualized, improvement of lodges, I guess in your thoughts, how do we get Grand Lodge to buy into it? Because they can't point to it on a PowerPoint and say, see, we're successful because we put it, we did this.
Sure. Before that, I want to go back to David's question from like 15 questions ago.
Sure.
The biggest impact
He's smarter than
I
I am anyway. Talk to him. So.
We changed at High Point where we were eating. So we used to really struggle with dinners. There was a family who would usually make all our food, but then they stopped coming to Lodge, and then a lot of our meals decreased. So we started eating at a restaurant before Lodge. That worked for a little while, but then it wasn't working for everybody. And the other group would go to dinner, and then another group would show up a little bit later because they didn't have time to get there, at 6 o'clock for the dinner. They would have time to eat and pay and get back to Lodge. So they just go straight to Lodge. And eventually we decided to go back to meeting at Lodge because the way, our Lodge adapted was we needed to kind of be less separated at dinner. And there's a family who would make really good food for us and liked doing it. So we periodically reassessed what we were doing for meals to kind of build camaraderie. The deciding factor is that, okay, yeah, there's about 2 or 3 brothers who'd show up to Lodge while the rest of us were at dinner. It's important to our Lodge that we include everybody. So we'll go back to our meals. And if our quality of our meals decreases again, then we'll probably go back to usually meeting at a restaurant. That was it, is really just taking time to assess what we're doing meal-wise and afterward. And that translated into actually meeting and hanging around Lodge for a longer period of time with more people. Coincidentally, that as we were focused on building that brotherhood, we'd have people say, in the parking lot masonries where, a lot of the best masonry happens, and we'd spend a lot of time hanging out in our parking lot with each other. Kind of as we made these changes to be more inclusive, it had a side benefit of changing other practices that we do. As far as getting Grand Lodge buy-in, it really kind of depends. I think in Ohio, we have a decent understanding that lodges need to have the flexibility to set their own kind of practices, as long as they maintain the core practices of what we do. And other jurisdictions might not have those same flexibility. But I think it just goes back to, and this might just be who our leadership is in any given state, that an understanding of good business practices is really important, right? And if you start looking at modern business practices, you'll see that a lot of the stuff these people are calling out, even going into the 90s, are things that we do masonically, or we used to do masonically, that we've gotten away from in place of best practices from like Bob Welch and those GE people whose company's not great anymore. But those things don't really work, and they're not really the best approach. So if you look at some of these books like the E-Myth, I had written in like the 1992 and I think revised 1996, he brings up Grunderjeef, which is a fairly esoteric mystical guy, towards the end of his book about, kind of the purpose of masonry stuff, or business, how to conduct business, and having a greater kind of sense of purpose for what you do. You see a lot of the practices in books like Culture Code, about how to build positive culture. What is culture and what does it mean? These are practices that we do intrinsically in Freemasonry, right? We create these safe spaces. We create the sense of vulnerability, these vulnerability loops where we do what we do. So to me, if I'm trying to convince a Grand Lodge officer about some of this stuff, I would probably talk. It really depends on what their approach is and why they believe what they believe. But I would look at, why are we doing the practices we're doing, and what is really good? And if they're a business guy or they're a numbers guy, looking at the best practices now and kind of the facts we have now, right? So one part of the business world is that business books are really notorious for having survivorship bias, right? My company was great. All these, Built to Last was about, companies that, survived the test of time. And then, within 10 years of being published, I think some of those companies have gone way down in their market value, and in some other stuff. And so it really just would go back to, one, building up this idea that the best way to get our groups to be a high performing group is to, one, let people decide themselves using these kind of standard practices in the business world now, which is, kind of letting them self-organize and decide well, and intervening only if you have to, when it's necessary. I think in Ohio, we've seen a lot of lodges kind of do that sort of stuff.
I had a comment about you talking about Grand Lodge. Just my impression here in Virginia, for the longest time, we had lip service every year. We need to increase membership. We need to increase membership. Not telling us how to do anything, but basically say increase your membership. There is a twofold approach I'm seeing from our Grand Lodge today. Number one is we have created this committee called Grand Lodge or Lodge Services, whose entire mission, and I've talked to people on the committee who don't realize what the committee is supposed to be doing, which is funny. Their whole purpose is to crunch the numbers and send a survey out to all the lodges and figure out how many members are in your lodge and all these other metrics, and then tell the lodges what they need to do to get better, to fix their problems. That's the theory. The other conflicting trend right now is, oh my God, you're doing something different. We're not going to let you do that. There is very much a sense in my Grand Lodge of we must be cookie cutter. You mentioned, David, you touched on this idea about franchises, touched on it. There is a mentality among some in Grand Lodge of Masonry should be cookie cutter. I should be able to walk into any lodge in Virginia and get the exact same experience I would get in any other lodge in Virginia. And that's very much being pushed by way of you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. You can't talk about traditional. I've gotten talked to about traditional observance lodges, which is being practiced elsewhere in the country, and we're talking about it. We don't allow that in Virginia. We're not allowed to have a chamber of reflection. Now, we don't, but we've talked about it, and I've got called out for wanting to even talk about it, to be careful not to say that we're not endorsing that. Stuff you brought up today, Taylor, fits neatly. If you go back and watch all of our videos, it's unintentional, but there's an ongoing thread of ideas through all of these meetings we've had. Totally unintentional, but it keeps coming back around again. If somebody, David and I joke about like 100 years from now, historians will take a look at all these videos and analyze them and all that. But the reality is, talking about observant lodges, what we're doing in observant lodges elsewhere in the country, and many of the things you brought up today are what observant lodges are doing. And so maybe if we label it something slightly different, we won't get in trouble. But the reality is, there's a whole lot of Masons out there saying, we are not doing something right. As I like to put it, I joined Masonry expecting this incredible life-altering experience. And what I have is terrific, but it's really not what I thought I was going to have. How can we get back to that? Or how can we put it in place if we've never done it? But I feel like it should be there, but somehow something's missing, and we need to be working to do that. And I think when the Grand Lodge says, you know, they're worried about making sure all the lodges do things a certain way, and they're worried about too much variance. Honestly, a lodge should be able to do whatever it wants to do. The whole point of the Grand Lodge, the Methodical Digest and all that is, your lodge must comply with this. You must elect your worshipful master. He must have been awarded. He must have a past master's certificate. He must have, you know, these are the broad lanes that every lodge must have. Mm-hmm. It does not specifically say in there, you're not allowed to have candles or incense or music or a chamber of reflection. So if it's not forbidden, if what you're doing is strictly in compliance with what you have to do, my opinion, you should be allowed to do it.
And we've tried doing that in Ohio. I can speak from, you know, and David and Taylor have helped for this. I mean, but it's not something that happens easily. Grand Lodges aren't ships that turn nimbly. It's if you're lucky, if you are in a position of any kind of influence, you might move it 2 inches, and you're hoping that a few years from now those 2 inches pay off. Yeah. In Ohio, I mean, we've been able to kind of push that conversation a little bit more. The hard part is, this is going to sound weird, but this is not an anti-Grand Lodge screed, but there is that push now for data-driven decisions in Grand Lodge, you know, and I'll be honest, Ohio has kind of been right there in the middle of it. But one of the hard parts is that, in my personal opinion, is I'm not always sure that Grand Lodges are asking the right questions or taking the right takeaways from the particular data. Because if you were to do this, the model that we have in Ohio is there is a way for a lodge to kind of identify their values and to, you know, do a self-assessment. If you were to collect that data and look at that data and manage each of those lodges individually as opposed to the aggregate, which is what Grand Lodge is looking at, you would see those small successes. You'd see those successes, you know, you'd measure success differently. But kind of like my question earlier, Grand Lodges are looking for something different. They're looking for, again, it's not to knock on Grand Lodges, they're looking to make a data-driven decision. And a lot of that data should be something they can put up on a PowerPoint slide and say, see, this year we raised this many Masons, raised this much money, did this much thing. That kind of granular success doesn't really involve Grand Lodge, other than just saying,
right.
And I think,
well, to talk about, to just go back to build on what you said, Chad. You're right that in Grand Lodge, there is a mindset that we need to do something. So we're going to do something. And data-driven, I think, captures it. We have a push to bring in, I think it's 600 new Masons this year or something like that. And maybe it's fair to ask the question, okay, let's say we go all out, we make sure we bring in 600 new Masons in Virginia. Is that going to make Masonry better in all of our lodges? I mean, honestly, we always want to bring in members. We need growth. We need to bring in members, but just saying by bringing in members, are we making things better, or are we not focused on the things that actually, if it's enjoyable for 10 of us to be in a room and enjoy brotherhood, and we're very happy with that, then that's a good thing. If I have 150 people, 200 people in my lodge and none of them show up, but they all pay dues, is that good? Are we making good Masonry there, or are we just pumping up the numbers?
I'll say one last thing. Go, Taylor.
Sorry.
So,
well,
let me say this and then I'm done. So that it's because Taylor and I will talk forever, and this is not about me, it's about Taylor. But I will say that Taylor, David, and I have each gotten in a little bit of trouble from time to time when somebody says to us, we need to get more Masons, and our response is, why? What? We need to get more guys in the lodge. Why? what does 50 get us that 40 doesn't? Like, and then that's when we get sort of weird looks. But Taylor is much better looking at data. Well, actually, no, he looks at data differently than I do, which is why I love him so much. So I'll let him talk, and I'm done talking. So
Okay. Then we'll get to David.
So I think what we're talking about is that there's been a push for a long time that you can optimize a system, right? That you can have this really tight tolerance on everything that you do, and that's somehow really good. So in my industry, I work in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and we had an instrument that reads pressure and can read out to like 3 decimal places. Our requirements for the process only go to 1 decimal place, and they're like, well, we have to adapt our requirements to meet this new the capabilities of the system, right? And the question that I always brought up is that, well, we're operating within a normal operating range, but there's a proven acceptable range that's much larger, that even if we exceed the range that we're technically supposed to stay within, it'll still be perfectly fine. Like that, it's a conservative approach to it. But 2, that adding the specificity doesn't actually improve the process or any of the outcomes that we care about, right? That you're optimizing something that doesn't have any impact.
Yes.
And then one of the things that we've seen in both in the business world and masonically and in the world in general is that you can optimize things and you can run these really tight plans. But when that happens, right? So this is kind of like lean manufacturing, the just-in-time manufacturing you see in the car industry, is that if something does go wrong, and it very often will, that you're going to run into immediate problems, right? So we had chip shortages that caused, cars to be half built, sitting on lots for a while. People driving around with cars that they bought with features that they still don't have in them 2 years later. That you're optimizing for a situation that exists for a period of time, but might not always continue to exist. And you might not know when it's changed, right? Because it's a complex world that we live in, or that there's, counterpartner risk in manufacturing where, you have 15 different suppliers, so you should always be hedged against a supply chain issue. But those 15 suppliers themselves have a supplier, 15 wide, but ultimately come back to one place, which is chip manufacturer. That there's this idea of the ranges that we have to operate in being fictitiously small, and that masonically speaking, we can operate within a fairly wide range of acceptable behavior and still get good outcomes, right? That even a lot of the required practices that we have, masonically speaking, from our code, are still fairly narrow to keep us, in line. But we could even operate outside of that and still be perfectly good. That we're oftentimes over optimizing or thinking we're optimizing a system when we're really just kind of increasing the risk. And by making every lodge standardized and the exact same, what you've done is introduced systemic risk to every lodge. So any lodge that has a problem, every lodge will have that problem. And you see this with membership, that for the most part, because we standardize how our lodges operate and they're all cookie cutter, that every one of those lodges now has the same exact problem. And right now for us, it's membership. And by trying to optimize and maximize our membership, what we're seeing is that that's a short-term optimization that creates long-term problems, right? So you can make a lot of really risky bets and make money in the short term. And stockbrokers do this, right? So it's not, the good stockbroker should have been in the industry for a long time, because you can make some really, you can make money short term, but a long term you'll lose your house, right? That the way that we're operating is kind of based on these ideas that aren't really true, right? In the largest sense, is that we're trying to operate within this kind of world that doesn't really exist. You don't have to have these really tight ranges for good lodge experience. You don't have to have, your metrics for your lodge don't actually have to be what Grand Lodge might think they should be. More importantly, if we even hit these metrics that they're talking about, or maybe even they don't really even exist, maybe, doesn't mean that we'll have long-term success. It could potentially be even more devastating for our lodges, right? That by trying to increase membership, all of a sudden now we have lodges who are running drug rings, right? Like P2 in Italy, that you could really risk the overall reputation of the fraternity and its strength by chasing some of these metrics that don't really give you the long-term results that you want. that's really been my argument with people in Ohio is that, look, we can talk about membership, but what you need is a strong core group, right? So you can look at networks, how networks work, and make sure we have a strong network of lodges, and ask why your networks are weak or not. And one of the things that we see is that Masonic life, and what some people are even pushing, is that everything, the more connected you are Masonically speaking to different institutions like the Scottish Rite, York Rite, and Shrine, Widowsons, if you're part of all these organizations, you're more likely to stay a member for a long time, which is true. But there's a hidden risk that if you're spending, 95% or even 80, 70% of your time within Masonic organizations by itself, and maybe only 30% with your kids or something like that, you don't have any other social group, and that you can't grow Freemasonry if the Masons don't have any social connections outside of Freemasonry. So what you've done is you've root bounded your if it's like a plant, right? We become root bounded, right? That we've outgrown the pot that we're in. We're not expanding our social group outside of it. You can supplement that with like taking people in from online in and risks like that, but ultimately you're creating this ecosystem within the Masonic world where you don't have time to be part of anything else, and to have friends who aren't Masons, and you can't grow an organization like ours that are based on friendships, or even grow friendships if you're pulling people in 20 different directions.
I want to say, you talk about optimization. Optimizing is good, but I mean, if you're doing this from a business perspective, and we can apply it to, we should be able to apply business rules to Masonry, which is what you're talking about. You need first say, what is my biggest weakness? What is my most inefficient aspect? And optimize that first. If you're optimizing the thing you're talking about, where you're within, if you're already 2 decimal places accurate and you want to get it down to 3, optimizing that doesn't give you any bang for the buck. You need to look at bang for the buck. What's my biggest problem? Let me optimize that process first and get an actual return before I worry about the next thing. But I want to let David have his question. And then we need to wrap it up. It's 12 o'clock. So
everybody's got all afternoon. I mean, I got again a number of thoughts going through my brain here, but I think the first thought I have is you often hear how Masonry needs to be run as a business, and I disagree. I don't think that is right. I don't think that's the right approach, and it goes to kind of back to Chad's question of what can Grand Lodge do, and I think the best thing that Grand Lodge can do is get out of the way. Yeah, I think yes. Grand Lodge is the victim of its own success. It has become so large that it's almost like a lot of business boards and so forth. They have to create a reason for them to be there. Whereas most of the time, I think, like you said earlier, Chris, there are certain things that Grand Lodge needs to do. They need to make sure that certain criteria are met, that, the bare minimum. But beyond that, they need to get out of the way and let the lodges do their own thing. So I don't have the answer to how to do this, but I think to Chad's question earlier, the short answer is what they need to do is figure out how to empower the lodges, to convince the lodges that they need to try new things, that they don't have to be a cookie cutter, and more importantly, that they are going to fail. But failure is the key to success. You never know what works until you fail a few times. And I think we've created an attitude or a culture in Masonry where I'm never going to try anything different because it might not work. And the excuse, and I do think it's just an excuse that most Masons give, is, well, Grand Lodge isn't going to like it. Whereas if Grand Lodge very actively said, we want you to try new things, we want you to be unique, we want you to meet these criteria, but figure out how to do Mason yourself, then I think we would be in a much better place. And that's why I said that's why I don't think the business model is the right idea, because a business model very much is, we want everything to be identical. We want, if you eat a McDonald's hamburger here or 500 miles away, it should taste exactly the same. That's not what in my opinion, not what Masonry should be.
I'll say this about, I think yes, it should not be run exactly like a business, but I think somewhere along the line, most of the businessmen got out of masonry, and we don't have anyone who understands business enough who's active. The people making decisions to keep a lodge going have never run a business and don't even understand basic business principles. So we need at least the minimum concept of, for example, we own a building. We own a physical building. We need to bring in X amount of dollars every year to keep that building going and shore up money in case there's a catastrophe like replacing the roof, which will happen eventually. We don't operate like that. We operate like we have this building we inherited, and as long as I'm bringing in dues every year, we're good. Everything's fine now. We'll slap some paint here now and again. We need to have long range planning, and most businesses do some kind of planning. Most lodges, sadly, the biggest problem, this goes back to something Taylor mentioned a while ago, I want to touch on. Many lodges I interact with, their biggest problem every year is electing a junior deacon. Who's going to be, David, we brought you in last year. We initiated you last year. You're a junior deacon, okay? Next year, okay, Graham just joined. He's going to be junior deacon this year. A lodge that is focused solely on getting the next junior deacon, and that's all they worry about, is stagnant. And that's why I left them and went to another one. Because if all you do is, if you only do enough to simply get a new junior deacon and get 5 people, if you go to a lodge where there's the 5 current officers, junior deacon through counting the secretary and treasurer, 7 officers, and 5 people on the sidelines, and you go back in 5 years and you have the current junior deacon through master, secretary, treasurer, same 5 past masters on the sidelines, and 5 years later it's the same. My mother lodge was like that until they finally folded. So a new guy came in, he's junior deacon. He went out as master, he went and joined another lodge, or he quit. And they have that cycle. And yes, that lodge keeps going. And then when you say we need to merge with a lodge, we don't want to lose our name. We don't want to lose our low number. We're doing fine. No, you're not. You're circling the drain for years and years and years and years and years. We have to bring in new members, to bring it back question somebody brought earlier. We do have to bring in enough members to offset death and demits and people who just go do something else. We need to bring in enough to keep us going and a little bit of growth. We don't need to double our membership. We need to make sure everyone we bring in actually attends and doesn't quit in 3 years. That's more important than how many we bring in. But
Yeah, I think it goes.
I think you guys are doing it the wrong way.
are we?
You're thinking that Grand Lodge thinks that they're there for themselves. They're not. They're there for the members. The members have to give instruction to Grand Lodge. This is what we want to do. You go away and do it. We're going to give you guys a project rather than you give us projects. Right? We're doing our little bit. We're paying our Grand Lodge dues or capitation or whatever it is. We want you to go and do consolidate the lodges, because there'll be lodge buildings that aren't in use somewhere in the UK or the US or Canada or Australia or wherever. Sell those lodge buildings, put the money towards something that's viable for the community and Freemasonry in general, which is what the tenet of the institution is all about. So here are the projects. We need a bank, if you can do it. Or a building society. We need a hospital. We need, what else? A nursing home and that type of thing. Go away, you do those. We'll run our little lodge rooms the way we see fit. So long as it's within the parameters of what Grand Lodge have permitted you to do, right? And then you've got to bring in your membership, like the old saying, build and they will come.
I think I agree with you, Graham, but the reality, at least here in the States, is Grand Lodges have become so entrenched in where they are and the focus is so much. The reality is, and at some point, I don't know how much of this is going to be on YouTube or not. The reality is the lodges created a Grand Lodge because we have to have one to manage certain things as an institution. We need our jurisdiction. We need to make sure that anyone who comes in here, any lodge that's formed has to be in the same Grand Lodge. They have a certain duty to perform. We've evolved just in the time I've been in to where the Grand Lodge exists for its own sake, and the lodges are just there to feed it money and to basically not talk back. And there is a strata of Grand Lodge officers. Hey, every man in Masonry should say, I've been elected to this job. You made the mistake of giving me this job for a year. I'll try not to screw it up best I can. And I'm going to be back amongst you when it's done. I'm no better than you. It's just, I was foolish enough to take this job you put me in. I fear that our Grand Lodge officers don't have that same mindset, that they are somehow a different level than the rest of us. Not all of them, but some lack that humility that you're there to serve a purpose. You're serving the entire 300 lodges in our state. You're there for us. I think it's going to be hard because Masons are basically intimidated by Grand Lodge. The Grand Master can come and take your charter. They can do a lot of, Grand Master has a whole lot of power. So naturally there's this deference, and it's difficult to convince enough Masons to say, look, Grand Lodge works for us, not the other way around. It's not a corporation. They're not our board of directors. They're not the stockholders. They're the ones that we chose among us to go there for a while, and they have to come back. Well, we're getting to a whole lot of topics, and I appreciate it. This is great. I love to run it all day, but it's after 12 o'clock. I do need to wrap this up. And I do need to mention, while Graham's still here, our next meeting, this is different, and tell your friends, it's not Saturday morning. This will be on Friday, April 28th at 8 p.m. here, Eastern time. In Australia, it's either 8, 9, or 10 a.m. on Saturday, the 29th. We are hosting a panel. I haven't had a panel discussion since like January last year. So I really want to have another panel discussion. It's called Brothers Down Under. All of our panelists are members of a lodge in Australia, and there are many will cover this. There are several Grand Lodges in Australia. They're not one big Grand Lodge. And we're going to ask some questions about what Masonry is like in Australia and contrast and compare to Virginia, which is my frame of reference. And I consider Virginia and Ohio and other states in America to be very similar in outlook for the most part. But basically, it's comparing Australian Masonry to more or less Virginia or American Masonry. Should be a lot of fun, but it's Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So maybe I'll get some more people to come out. I don't think our lovely co-host will be with us because Brian has fun on Friday nights. You're muted, Brian. You're muted, Brian.
And it's 1 o'clock in the morning, of course, my time. Which
Right. And I said, well, isn't your party done by then? And apparently it isn't. So unlike Graham, who stumbles home from the pub at 1 a.m. to come attend these meetings, Brian's party is still going strong over there in Cornwall at 1 a.m. his time. So I can't accommodate you, Brian. I had to accommodate my Australian brothers and my American brothers to make sure it's, but this is great. I've got a worldwide audience here, which is really, really cool if you think about it. Graham is a regular attendee, and he's 13 times away from me, which is pretty awesome. Anyhow, so that should be fun. It's Friday the 28th. I'll put the word out on Facebook. And we have other fun speakers coming up. I want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you very much, Taylor. That was a really interesting discussion. I love to keep going, but I really do kind of need to wrap this up. I'm sure we can keep going more. I wanted to ask Chad before I left. David and Taylor, would you guys be interested in, I've tried to do these in the past where we have a topic driven thing and it didn't really take off. Plan one of these unstated where we have a topic and everyone comes prepared. Instead of having one speaker, set a topic like lodge, improvement thing. I don't know. Kind of like what we're going on today, but kind of have a couple of topics and just kick it around between us instead of having one formal speaker. Would y'all be interested in participating in that?
I'm game.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I want to say, as this thing I have here, this unstated meeting thing evolves, I keep trying different things. I love the panel discussions. They go real well. I mean, it's good having a speaker like a traditional, research lodge would have a speaker and Q&A. And we did that today, and that was great. But if I can get more people interested in doing the back and forth, I think it'll be more interesting to get a bunch of people together and just kind of have a general topic, and everybody has their own perspective. And that will be, I think it'll be fun to do. So we'll plan one of those in the future. And Brian put a link in the chat for the Global Masonic Check Group. If you want to check that out, please do. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We have over 50 of these videos we put on YouTube, which is pretty cool. And I plan to go back and cut them down a bit so they're a bit more manageable and just have the speaker in the Q&A. I'm slowly working on that. But I want to thank you all for coming out. You guys have a wonderful day. We'll see you all soon.
See you in 13 days.
Bye, everybody.